Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. On August 10, 2022, a federal jury convicted a former Twitter employee of acting as an unregistered foreign agent for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. While employed by Twitter, the individual accepted payments in exchange for accessing and conveying the private information of Twitter users to Saudi officials. That individual is one of two former Twitter employees charged by the Department of Justice for their efforts to provide Saudi officials with the personal information of dissidents and activists critical of the Saudi regime, including sensitive data that could identify and locate these individual users. Now the question, as head of security, Mr. Zatko, can you describe the types of efforts you've seen by foreign governments to infiltrate, control, exploit, or surveil Twitter and its users, and share what steps Twitter and regulators should have taken to protect against these attacks?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
One of the disturbing things that I saw, based upon being 10 years behind where I would expect a modern tech company to be, was a lack of an ability to internally look for and identify inappropriate access within their own systems. Other than the person who I believed with high confidence to be a foreign agent placed in a position from India, and from it was only going to be from an outside agency or somebody alerting Twitter that somebody already existed, that they would find the person. What I did notice when we did know of a person inside acting on behalf of a foreign interest as an unregistered agent, it was extremely difficult to track the people. There was a lack of logging and an ability to see what they were doing, what information was being accessed, or to contain their activities, let alone set steps for remediation and possible reconstitution of any damage. They simply lacked the fundamental abilities to hunt for foreign intelligence agencies and expel them on their own.
You said it was difficult to track. Explain exactly what you mean about that, what you mean, and secondly, what could be done to correct that?
One of the most senior engineers in the company came to me not long after I was there and said, "Mudge, you should know that this company doesn't really have centralized logging. We don't log the activities of the systems." I was surprised by this. Most tech companies, most companies I know of, even not in tech, have logs about what's happening on their systems. And this tells you who tried to log in, who was doing what, where, when it happened. Later on in my tenure, I learned that there were thousands of failed attempts to access internal systems that were happening per week, and nobody was noticing. And when we brought this up, people said, well, who is it? What is it? And I said, that's what we're trying to find out. Why weren't we even being aware of this? This fundamental lack of logging inside Twitter is, a remnant of being so far behind on their infrastructure and the engineers not being given the ability to put things in place to modernize. I can give an example. Let's suppose you have 5 credit cards and you're receiving statements each month, but only 2 of those statements give you detailed transactions. And you want to see if there's fraud on your credit cards. Well, first off, 3 of those credit cards, you're not going to be able to look at the transactions. You just know the total bill. And those remaining 2, you don't have time to go through the transactions and look for it. So you kind of wing it and say, I need all those credit cards to stay alive. So you just keep paying off the bills. That's kind of the analogy I have for the production environment and the logging situation at Twitter. So you can understand that trying to understand what an adversary inside identified is doing can be pretty challenging without logs.
Have you thought about how one would design legislation which would maintain some basic necessary rights and yet cover this area?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the regulators because, of course, I was very curious as to, how was Twitter still operating like this since there was a 2011 consent decree that was aimed at addressing a fair amount of this. I noticed a few things. One, there were a lot of evaluations and examinations which were interview questions. So essentially, the organization was allowed to grade their own homework. Did you make things better? Yes, we did. Okay, check. There wasn't a lot of ground truth. There wasn't a lot of quantified measurements, and a fair amount of the interviews came from companies, auditors that Twitter themselves were able to hire. So I think that's a little bit of a maybe conflict of interest. I also noticed that of all of the regulators, some of the foreign regulators were much more feared than the FTC. For instance, the French CNIL, the CNIL, the French version of the FTC, terrified Twitter in comparison to the FTC. And when I looked at why, it was because there was more of a fear that it wouldn't be a one-time fine. One-time fines are priced in. One-time fines didn't bother Twitter at all. When I saw the recent amount of the fine, that was much less than we had been concerned about. And each time it was a one-time fine, in my discussions with the chief privacy officer, with the privacy engineer head, that was and the executives, the thought was, okay, we'll pay that and we can keep kicking the can down the road and hope, maybe we'll get another one-time fine. Wall Street didn't seem to care because it wasn't a long-term problem that was ongoing. What did make these companies afraid was if there was a risk of, hey, you've mishandled the same type of data repeatedly. Maybe we're not going to let you monetize
Sorry,
that type
who
of data.
mishandled the data?
Oh, so if Twitter, for example, Twitter mishandled email addresses repeatedly. And a concern was if the FTC were to come in and tell us that we're not allowed to monetize email addresses because of our continued inability to handle them correctly, well, then we might not be on fair footings with our competitors, and that scared them and made them move. I believe something like that did happen to Facebook, which has been used as a sort of cautionary tale inside organizations. So I think the regulators have tools that do work, but they're not able to see which tools in their tool belt are the ones actually working, and they're using the one-time fines that the companies aren't really afraid of.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Senator Lee?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zatko, thanks for being here. In your disclosures, you include information that Twitter's head of privacy engineering and the chief privacy officer report